Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Prayers of Fire podcast. I'm again joined by Logos, episode 51 of the Church Fathers, Irenaeus Against Heresies Book II, chapters 11 to 15. Okay, so chapter 11. Irenaeus argues that the Gnostics absurdly believe that God himself did not create all things, but lower orders of beings such as angels, and without his knowledge. Irenaeus says he will prove that there was one God, creator of all. Before he explains the Christian position on God the Creator, he will examine and refute the Gnostic doctrine of creation. He will do this for two reasons. One, in hopes of converting them, or two, to convince them to change their arguments in response to the Christian refutation. Okay, 11 is a little self-explanatory, so we'll move on to 12. The doctrine of the tricontat is refuted in both excess and defect. They claim that Christ's ministry, beginning with when he was 30, points to this reality. Firstly, the defect. The propator is considered among the aeons. Yet the one who produces all cannot be considered in the category of those things produced. The uncreated impassible one cannot be placed in the company of the created impassible. Therefore, there are not 30 aeons, but 29. With regard to the excess, the first production of Anoia, thought, and siege, silence, cannot both be understood as distinct from Bythus himself, or if so, they should have a distinct figure, not like Bythus. If Aeonia continued with the propator, why do all the other aeons are considered ignorant of his greatness? If Bythus and Aeonias together produce something, then that thing must of necessity be of the same nature and substance as that form from which it came, and no difference at all. These things cannot be separate, as water cannot be separated from being wet. Given that Gnostics believe that male and female aeons exist side by side, they should always do so. The Gnostics argue that the aeon Sophia, without her consort Theletus, conceived through passion the world. Either the production of substance is always the result of a male and female aeon united, or it is not. How could Sophia generate without her male double? If Sophia could be destroyed from Theletus, then in theory so could the other aeons, each from each other. It is impossible that Sophia should suffer passion apart from Theletus. If they concede the point and allow for the aeons to be destroyed from each other, then they accept an impossibility. How could the propator and aeons be conjoined and in unity in the proloma if destruction is allowed? They produce substances without being in unity with each other. The Ogdoad is overthrown by the conjoining of opposites. Siege, silence cannot coexist with logos, speech, as one is the negation of the other, as light drives out dark and vice versa. If they say that logos exists within siege, then they have destroyed speech. They must either exclude siege or logos from the first Ogdoad, thereby destroying it. If the eons are united to produce substances, how could Sophia produce alone? Or if they are united, how could silence and speech be present at the same time? Horus the Divider was either produced by the propator or Monogenes. This entails that not only the 30 aeons exist, but 4 more: propator, Christ, Holy Spirit, Horus. Since the propator is within the pleroma, and these other 3 are produced in the same fashion, by what reason are the 4 left out? If the latter are weaker than the former, they do not deserve the name aeons, or are they superior? How can they be weaker if they were produced to the establishment of the others? They cannot be superior to those who produced them. The first tetrad. The tetrad ought to be included in the list of the aeons. The tricontat is refuted by both defect and excess. Further reasoning shows that the Ogdoad and duodecad are refuted as well. The whole system falls to pieces. Okay, so there's a lot here in 12. What do you have, Logos?
Confusion. Lots of confusion.
All right, lay it on me.
Oh, there's nothing profound here, man. There's so many names and somebody begot somebody else that I couldn't even follow what the argument was about.
Okay, so here's how I envision it. I think chapter 12 has a few discrete arguments. So let's look at the first one. He's saying, let's see, the first one is why is the propator not considered an aeon? Why is he considered an aeon given that he produced all the others? So if he produced all the others, then they are fundamentally different from him, and he shouldn't be considered of the same order of being as they are. That's the first argument.
Okay, who is a propator? I don't remember hearing about him. I thought like Bythus was like top dog Eon or whatever. I don't even know who this propator guy is.
It's another name he goes by. I remember the propator.
Okay. I mean, so thinking about the argument, ignoring like the who begot who part of this story, which is just so weird, I could never be a Gnostic. I mean, if 2 parents produce a kid, the kid is the same substance or kind as the parents that produce the kid. I mean, surely. It just seems to me that they're talking about like a family of gods. So if like, I don't know, Zeus and Hera have a baby and it's another god or something, it's a god like Zeus or Hera. It doesn't seem that strange to me.
Well, the difference is, right, Bithis is supposed, or Bithis slash Propator is supposed to be the uncreated source of all being.
Yes.
Right. So even if he produces other things, they are not like him because their being is dependent upon him.
I guess it depends on the analogy. If they're going for like some kind of emanation model or something like a Thomist model, then that'd be true. If they're going for just something like a progenitor model, like parents having kids, then I'm not sure.
Sure. I guess that's an open question, right? Because it's
Yeah.
not clear. So that's the first argument, right?
Mhm.
The second argument then is how can thought and silence be distinct? So Anoia is thought, siege is silence. How could they be distinct from Bithis himself, aka Propator? Let's see. Yeah, this is where I got a little confused too, because he seems to be saying if you're produced by the thing and then are produced by the thing produced by the thing, you have knowledge of where you came from. So how can there be ignorance? How can you have the Sophia?
Right.
That seems to be the second argument.
Yeah. And that one was kind of a head scratcher for me too. I didn't understand the names, but I did catch that little ray of wisdom in the text or whatever you want to call it. It's like, I don't know. I could imagine being a kid never knowing who like my grandfather was. Maybe he died before I was born, never met him. I know I've got one and know something produced me, don't know anything about him. And so if we're going for like a progenitor model, that would make some sense. If we're going for like an emanation model, I mean, divine hiddenness is a discussion even among like Catholics. I mean, Catholics are in a really big campaign right now trying to bring college students back in the fold, because once kids go to college, like a huge chunk of them like abandon the faith. And it's like, what do we do about this? It's like, well, if they had like genuine experiences with the God that creates and sustains them, they'd have no reason to like abandon their faith. So it's like, what do we do? Well, they're trying to like, give them Bibles with commentary on the church fathers and a bunch of other stuff to ameliorate the problem. But I mean, at base, like the question of divine hiddenness is like a huge thorn, even for like direct sustenance of like Thomism and things like that. So I'm not sure his argument really works.
Yeah. So the third argument is all of the eons except Sophia make a production of something else by a divine pairing. So you either have to say that all productions of eons are the result of a divine pairing, therefore rendering Sophia's enthemesis impossible, or Sophia can produce without a divine pair, which then indicates that anybody else could, which would then sort of disrupt the model because producing without a divine pair creates this fallen universe.
Right. Yeah, I saw that one too. Um there's some more there to that one, I think, but it's kind of interesting. Um
The
I'm
other
trying to
thing I want
figure.
to add to that real quick is actually this makes Sophia higher than the other Aeons because she's now like Bithis because she can produce without anyone else.
Exactly. Yeah, and
That's a problem.
but it's also an interesting commentary on the first argument, because it does show that the offspring is relevantly like the progenitor in some crucial fact. So eons are producing things like eons, and then her all the way down the causal chain is showing this in the fact that she can kind of self-produce in the same way one of the top ones in the chain could.
Except it's bad when she does it. So is it bad when Bithis does it?
Now that's a really interesting question. Yeah, I mean, from an internal critique of the model, if eons produce solo, is there a is there necessarily a defect in what they produce? And if there is, like the whole causal chain is like in real trouble. But there's also the causal argument question is kind of interesting here, because it shows like the arbitrariness of the story. Like you're saying that these people coupled and produce these things, these coupled produce these things, but like they can produce solo. Why was any of this necessary? How do we know that all of this isn't like a just so story?
Yeah.
is basically what the critique's going to come down to. And that part I think he's right about for sure.
The other part is the fourth argument is opposites cannot be in the presence of each other. So siege is silence, logos is speech. One is the opposite of the other. They can't both be coexisting in the same space together because one negates the other.
Yeah, that's the last one I remember you saying. And I don't know. Can you guess what my first word's going to be in response to this?
No, I can't.
Hegel.
Hegel. Oh, you mean thesis, antithesis, synthesis?
Right. So this would seem so like I think Hegel would have some commentary here, right? Sometimes it's not that like two opposites coexist with each other, but sometimes two opposites in their working against each other produce an outcome that's a synthesis of the two opposites. And so if they're going for a model something like that, though they probably didn't have Hegel's language at the time, I think that's one way out.
Sure. Okay. The next argument seems to be there are four other, the tetrad doesn't seem to fit anywhere. The Probator, Christ, who is produced, the Holy Spirit, and Horus. And remember, one account there's two Horuses, so whatever.
Oh man.
Right. So in what relation do they stand to the other aeons? Are they above them or below them? Well, I guess the Probator would be above them, but the other three were produced by the other aeons, so they would be below them. Remember, I think it was Christ that was produced by all the aeons together, at least according to one Gnostic story we got.
And there's the other one where there was some guy that made the world, but he made it kind of full and empty. And they're like his mother like gave everything souls or something, and something about that synthesis like made Christ. Such a weird story, man. This whole thing's weird.
Yeah. So he basically argues that these four can't neatly be placed within the pleroma without, messing things up.
I mean, the whole pleroma is just chaos in a bottle anyway, so he's probably right, even if I don't know why.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, so now we're going to go to 13. Irenaeus argues it is contradictory to argue that Nous and Aletheia were produced by Bythus and his Aeona. Nous is the chief and highest principle, and Ennoia arises from an emotion. Therefore, the latter could not have arisen from the former. It would be more correct to say that Ennoia was produced by the Propator and the Nous. Though thought follows this pattern: change, knowledge, sense, creating, administering, governing power, and self-direction. Process of thought. When the Anoa controls the soul, we have enthemesis. This then becomes a sensation. This then becomes counsel. This then becomes examination of the thought, judgment. This then becomes the logos of reason, which then becomes the logos of speech. All motion of thought is one and the same, nous. The human body as it ages receives a different term, not based on change in substance, but a change in countenance. Nous governs all thought. Thought is good because it is the product of man's body and soul. It is suitable to his nature. If men say that God sent forth Ennoia and then Nous from Ennoia, and then Logos, an error has occurred in that they are describing affections to God and the tendencies of man. It is an error to ascribe the aspects of man to God. If they had studied the scriptures, they would have known that God is not like men. He is without affections and passions. He is simple and uncompounded, without parts, alike and equal to himself. God is above all properties and might be rightly called understanding, which comprehends all things. God is not like any material or limited thing. If God produces intelligence, then he must be a corporeal being. If intelligence sets forth intelligence, then God is severed from himself and divided into parts. If something is emitted from some source, say a ray of light from the sun, the ray of light must of necessity move into something to contain it. If God issued intelligence from himself, what space contains the emission? Something as old as God? This is nonsense. If intelligence was not sent forth the Father but remains in him, then intelligence is nowise something separate from the Father, ergo no emission. If all the eons of the pleroma who sprung from intelligence remain in the Father, they can in no way be ignorant of him. They might argue that those internal aeons are contained within a sphere within the Bythus. If so, then what sphere contains the Bythus? Therefore, the Bythus is either a vacuum or the universe itself is contained within him. That which a thing is framed by must also partake in that thing. If Bythus frames the eons, they must partake in him and therefore are not ignorant of him. No degeneracy is possible. If they say he is a vacuum, they deny God is spiritual in nature. The nous cannot be the first production. If they argue that logos and zoe are the product of the nous, this is redundant, since all is contained in Bythus and therefore not different from him. Zoe cannot be the sixth aeon, since God is life and life must exist before intelligence. They are coterminous. A living intelligent being has both at the same time. How can the intelligence of God be devoid of life? What do you expect from people who argue that siege silence helped the probator create? The Gnostics argue that the word was produced by man and not man by the word. They are blinded by their own passions and imagine a God that did not exist and deceive others. Okay, so where do you want to start, Logos?
I have no idea who these names are. There's some type of argument being made that somebody couldn't produce somebody because these names reference things like thought and speech and knowledge and a bunch of stuff. I'm not well versed enough in the connections to know what exactly the problem is, and so that's my first hang up.
Sure. Let's see. Okay, so nous, I think, means mind or will in Greek, and that's the highest principle. And then anoia arises from emotion. Okay, so passion. Well, what he's basically arguing is that, as far as I can tell, God is impassible. Okay, so if one of the eons is passion, anoia, then it is being produced by God. And of course, remember, I think it was a passion that Sophia used to produce the fallen universe.
Mm-hmm.
So the highest principle of the will, especially in God, cannot produce passion. Furthermore, passion, suffering, is something contained in men, not in God. So it's just not proper to the divine nature to say that the divine nature has passion. That, I think, in a nutshell, is what Irenaeus is saying.
Okay, that's kind of interesting. I don't know that I agree even from a biblical standpoint, because when God says, he created such and such and saw it was good in Genesis, I don't know what that would mean, if not to say that like God has some, I don't know, passion for his handiwork. He's like, yeah, I did pretty good there, So I don't know what it means to say that God's impassible, or I'm thinking about like after the flood when God made the rainbow. It's like, yeah, that kind of sucked. I'm gonna not do that again. Here's a rainbow. Like this the whole thing when you're listing out the arguments, God can't be composed of parts was one of the things you said. It all looked like divine simplicity stuff.
Yeah, it did.
And I'm scratching myself and I'm like, wait a minute, this is way before Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah.
I thought Thomas Aquinas was the divine simplicity guy. So, I mean, does divine simplicity talk like precede Aquinas? Do we think that like this is like people going back and messing with the text again? What do we make of this? This is weird.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the actual place that I quoted from, because I was reading my notes, but he does talk about, let's see, division, parts. I think. Okay, so this is paragraph 5 of chapter 13. But if they affirm that the intelligence was set forth from intelligence, they cut asunder the intelligence of God and divide it into parts. And whither has it gone? Whence was it set forth? For whatever is set forth from any place passes. Okay, it's not what I want. Oh no, I can't seem to find the original source. Did you say simple? Yeah, here we go. Sorry, it's in 3. For the Father of all is at the very distance from these affections and passions which operate among men. He is simple, uncompounded being, without diverse members, and altogether like and equal to himself, since he is holy understanding and holy spirit and holy thought and holy intelligence. Okay, that does kind of sound like divine simplicity, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean that just sounds like a Thomist talking about how all the divine attributes are identified with one another.
Well, now remember, the next book, book 3, I think Irenaeus is going to begin discussing the Christian doctrines, because he's then going to contradistinct the Christian doctrines to the Gnostic doctrines. So we'll just put a bookmark here. Maybe this is a faulty translation. Maybe we're missing something, but
maybe
But yeah, it is interesting. This seems on the surface to be a strong argument that he's making in favor of divine simplicity. We'll see if he says anything later on that may confirm or deny that.
Yeah.
Let's see. That's one argument. The other argument is God, their conception of God, if God produces intelligence, he must be a corporeal being, because if intelligence is sent forth from itself or sent forth from God and then becomes a thing independent of God, there must be like the sun emitting a ray of light. There must be some space to receive it, right? So the ray of light is received by the universe from the sun, but what receives the pleroma, I guess, right? That's what would receive the aeon of understanding. But then I guess Irenaeus is saying, but does that mean the pleroma is then co-eternal with the Bythus and he's not the sole existent thing? But then again, some Gnostic accounts say that the siege is also co-eternal with Bythus. So there you go.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that argument. And or it remains within the Father, which means it isn't an emission, which means all the other aeons that are produced by it are also contained within the Father, which means that no one could be ignorant of the Father since they're all contained in him. That would be the other alternative to, what.
Yeah.
And if they take that other alternative, then the entire thing falls apart because you can't have Sophia then. And then the last argument seems to be he wants to say that life and intelligence are coterminous. You can't have one before or without the other. I mean, I guess you could have life without intelligence. That'd be an animal. But that seems to be the other argument. So any commentary on those two arguments?
Sorry, I tried to say in chat that I had to AFK for a second. Somebody was knocking on my window randomly. Can you go over that last argument again?
Yeah, the last argument was he seems to be saying that you can't have intelligence without life. They are coterminous with each other. So Zoe cannot be an aeon produced after intelligence, since you have to be alive to be intelligent.
That's really interesting. It depends on what definition of life we're going to take, right? Because God isn't alive via a biological definition of life. He doesn't, go through, darn it, the word escapes me. Homeostasis. God doesn't go through homeostasis. God doesn't sexually reproduce. God doesn't do all the things that biologically we describe of living things. And, yet God is intelligent. In fact, this guy would say that God is intelligence. He is intelligence. He is spirit and so on. So if they're talking about life in terms of like animal life rather than like the purely divine life, that might be an interesting commentary to take on it.
Yeah. Again, I think there's a lot here, and even again, I'm sure I'm probably missing something because it's hard to follow. But this is what I've come up with, given what we have. Because again, it's complicated and convoluted.
You're doing better than I did.
All right. Sorry, go ahead.
I said you're doing better than I did. I couldn't dig a lot of these arguments out. Like I was reading it, I'm just like my eyes glazed over.
Yeah. I think part of the problem is it's very easy to miss the forest for the trees. All the names, the sort of numerological signs like duodecad, tricontad, ogdoad, and then the names of which represent different aspects of a living being, like Zoe's life, Logos' speech. That's the trees, right? And it's easy to lose the forest for the trees.
Well, it's really easy too when they're saying such and such can't produce such and such because these two things are opposites and this shouldn't be begotten from this. The order's actually switched. You actually have to know to follow the arguments like what tree produces what fruit, so to speak.
Yes.
And if you can't line up all the names with all the stuff and you can't remember what's going on in the story, it's just like, you might be right, dude. There's so much going on here. I'll just kind of take your word for it because this is nuts.
No, you're right. And I don't even remember well, and there's also contradictory accounts of
Yeah,
Aeon. So which one is he actually responding to here?
right.
Is it just, there was like one part of like book 2 or the end of book 1 where he had like 4 different Gnostics giving like different accounts of the same events, and they were radically different.
Yeah, there was like Marcus, there was Valentinius, and there was like a couple other ones. There's like the weird sorcerer
Vaseline,
guy.
yeah. It was confusing. So I don't blame you. So chapter 14. Now this is okay. So the Gnostics are putting on a gloss at classical pagan myths. Antiphanes in his Theogony argues that chaos was produced by night and silence, which produced love and then light, and from this came the first generation of the gods. Gnostics have taken this parable to be their own and given their own names to each. The Gnostics sew together a doctrine of God from the cloth of the comic poets and the philosophers who are ignorant of God, and wore a miserable garb not their own. It is old and useless, being sewn from old fables and false beliefs. Thales and Homer argue that water is the origin of all things, and Anaximander laid down that infinity is the origin of all things, and Anaxagoras states that animals are formed by seeds falling from heaven. All these doctrines have been incorporated in Gnosticism under different names. From Democritus and Epicurus comes the idea of shade and vacuity. The vacuum of the pleroma is that analogous to the vacuum of the atoms. When they say that the images of the things below are productions of the things above, they cite Plato and Democritus. From Democritus, we get the idea that things below partake in the image of the things above, and then we get Plato. The Gnostics hold that the creator demiurge is a product of pre-existing matter, such as the doctrine of Anaxagoras, Empedocles, and Plato. They teach that the creator is a slave to necessity and cannot impart immortality, a doctrine derived from the Stoics, the poets and historians, men ignorant of God. As to the claim that the Savior's production of all the eons, is this to be taken from the legend of Pandora of Hesiod? Pandoros means all gifts, all gifted. The notion that they are free from pollution is in the committing of vile acts due to their spiritual nature is taken from the Cynics. In fact, they follow the members of that school. Rationalistic hair-splitting and subtle questioning is from Aristotle. Their numerology is derived from Pythagoras. Did these men already know the truth? If so, why did the Savior need to descend? Was he merely going to bring truth to the thoughts to those who already knew? If men did not know the truth and the Savior gave it to them, how can they boast of knowing all truth? These men are who Paul warned of as purveyors of false knowledge. If they say that the mother above knew the demiurge was ignorant and the wise were given knowledge from her, Irenaeus would say, firstly, that this knowledge is not incomprehensible. Men were able to know it. Secondly, if the mother and the wise know that Christ have this knowledge, and Christ lied when he said nobody knows the Father but the Son. They falsely ascribe to God in the eons human feelings and passions, showing they are ignorant of God. The doctrines of the Gnostics are lies from the beginning. The Gnostics in his lies is like a hunter in his bait. The hunter baits the animal with tasty food until the animal is lured into a trap and captured. The animal is then cruelly treated. Irenaeus again repeats the fact that he has described the Gnostic doctrines and states they are false. They use names and productions of names to produce something more than what it seems. So, I think a lot of this is paint by numbers. He's basically saying a lot of these ratios, numbers, names, relationships are all derived from poets and philosophers and are therefore not unique to the Gnostics, quote, giving a lie to their idea of special knowledge.
Yeah.
But I think within each of these, there's some interesting things here. First of all, unlike Justin the Martyr in the first apology, which he's pretty favorable to Socrates, and then we sort of are on the fence about the dialogue with Trypho, he's really favorable to the philosophers. Irenaeus is not at all friendly to any of these guys.
That's true.
At all. Like, he's far more philosophically rigorous than Justin. He's making pretty cogent arguments in the beginning of book 2, but he's not favorable to any of them. I think it's totally unfair the way he treats my boy Aristotle. I'm just not happy with this. They also strive to transfer the treatment of matters of faith at hair-splitting and subtle mode of handling questions, which is in fact a copying of Aristotle. That's just not fair. That's not how Aristotle does philosophy. It sounds more like Plato, hair-splitting.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds more like a Platonic dialogue than Aristotle's Ethics or something.
Well, it depends, right? On the one hand, the Platonic dialogues do like ask a lot of questions and questions and questions, trying to get at the root of something, but the concepts are pretty big. Aristotle, from what I understand about Aristotle, really gets down to the small and nitty gritty, right? So how does an acorn become a tree? If you look at like how Platonic dialogue would understand of it, you know, everything would be broad concepts. How does an acorn become a tree? Can it give that which is not? Blah 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 blah. Very big, questions about what it is to be a tree, what it is to be an acorn, how can something give to something else, what is time, so on and so forth. A lot of metaphors about doctors and horses, and we've been through the Platonic dialogues.
Yeah.
What does Aristotle do? It's like, well, it's an acorn a tree. You have acts, you have potencies. You have all the different causes, the formal, the final, blah, 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 blah. So you have all these different causes, acts and potencies. They combine in certain ways to combine like these types of changes in being versus those types of changes in being. I can understand people that might describe that as hair splitting because he really does categorize everything to really fine
Sure.
points.
Sure. But unlike the Gnostics, I think Aristotle actually gets somewhere.
Oh, that's true. That's true. He's doing your boy Aristotle dirty. It's not like he's hair splitting for no reason. He is a hair splitter, but it's for a good cause.
It is for a good cause. Now, the others, I'm not a huge fan of. I mean, Pythagoras and Plato are kind of interesting, and I've already before dealt with them. Like, for example, from the Pythagoreans, the Roman Numa realized, the founder of the Roman religion, actually, according to Plutarch, realized that God cannot be depicted in an image, and that he, like the Hebrews, I mean, not that Plutarch makes reference to the Hebrews, but like the Hebrews, he banned the production of images in Rome for 150 years.
Wow.
So, yeah, base Pythagoreans, because he got that from their doctrines, according to Numa. So, I mean, as a Christian, I think you'd want to like give them the. Now, again, he's pointing out where the Gnostics copied people, so he's not really here to like praise any of these philosophers. He's just here to say that it's derivative. But like, give props to Pythagoras though, because come on, God is not depicted in the image.
Yeah.
The Christian should be supportive of that. Lastly, I think what's really interesting is paragraph 9, where he says, they give out names plausible and credible to the heathen as being familiar to those who were called the 12 gods. And even those they will have to be images of the 12 aeons. But the images so called can produce names of their own, much more seemly and more powerful through their etymology to indicate divinity than are those of their fancied prototypes. Is this like a simulacra he's talking about?
Sounds that way.
Because, right, the name is producing something more powerful than the name itself would signify.
Mm-hmm.
Which, ultimately, what Irenaeus is complaining about is it doesn't signify anything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there you go. The Silver Cord of Baudrillard. Okay, the wrap up, 15. Well, before we get to 15, do you have anything to say about chapter 14?
I think I had something, but I long forgot it.
15. The Gnostics claim that the creation is an image of the eons, not the eons of the creation. The 30 eons are represented in the 30 days of the month. Yeah, this is weird. He says the 12 are found in the 12 hours in the day and the 12 months in the year. Well, there aren't 12 hours in a day.
Yeah.
I don't know what to make of that. That's just weird.
It is.
What was the first Well, he also has some weird stuff later on, so... What was the first begotten in Ogdoad and not some other number? Why did Logos and Zoe produce 10 aeons and Anthropos and Ecclesia 12 and not some other number? Why is the entire Pleroma divided into 3, Ogdoad, Decad, and Duodecad, and not some other number? The eons are more ancient than the creation and must therefore possess principles in themselves. The Christians give an account of the creation that is harmonious with things as we see them. The problem is, if the Gnostics argue that the Pleroma was created by the Father for the sake of creation, the shadow of the Pleroma, then the Pleroma was not made on its own account, but for some other lesser thing. Okay, so argument 1, all these numbers are arbitrary. Why did they pick them? And then 2, going back to the earlier argument about the universe being the shadow of the Pleroma, he's saying he's revisiting that problem.
Yeah, argument 1's interesting because it's a contingency argument. It's basically a Leibnizian argument. Whatever number you pick to ground God in whatever respect you're trying to do is arbitrary. because you can't find me the sufficient reason why that number, not in any other number. So he's making I mean, Leibniz was more concerned about like composition, things composed of other things, like my hand being composed of its bones and muscles of sinews, and they're being composed of its atoms and whatever else, all the way down to the monads. But the more contemporary Leibnizian arguments, which we're kind of coming around to, Joshua Rasmussen really likes to get into these ones. It's basically this exact kind of argument. Like, what kinds of things cannot characterize whatever the foundation of reality is? It can't be a shape because its sides and enclosures and whatever its boundaries are arbitrary. It can't be a number. It can't be a color, right? Here's all the things it can't be, because why couldn't it be the way it is, not some other way? And he's basically making that kind of argument. So it's really interesting that this conversation that's still contemporary to the philosophical debate is this old, quite frankly. I forgot what the second argument was, but that was interesting too.
The second argument was he was revisiting the problem of the universe being the shadow of the pleroma, which he seems to be saying here indicates that the pleroma was not made for its own sake, but for some other lower reason, which then de-elevates it from its exalted position of containing all.
Yeah, that's like that again reminds me of John Stuart Mill's argument about omnipotence, means, and ends. It sounds like what he's arguing is that the pleroma itself is a means to some other end of whatever higher thing created it. And so it's not a divine being. It itself is just one more tool. And so I think snarkily hidden in that would be like an Occam's razor like jab, which, Occam's razor wouldn't come around until the Middle Ages. But like, this seems to be the idea. If all you're talking about is just one more tool used by a primary creative thing, you're just kind of like mucking up the model with this extra tool of a tool of a tool of a tool that finally gets here. Why can't we just cut out the tools, cut out the middlemen, and just talk about God to us, so to speak?
Well, if you remember a couple episodes before, he did talk about the tool of a tool of a tool.
He did. He seems to be kind of harking back to that. So it's Mill's argument and it's Occam, which is also interesting, how these old arguments kind of branch out into these arguments we still talk about today.
Yeah, Irenaeus is definitely one of the more thoughtful, interesting of these guys. I think what also helps Irenaeus is that much less of his work was altered or fabricated.
Yes.
Poor Justin got done dirty. Like, there was something like 10 or 11 dialogues attributed to him, of which 8 are now all accepted to be frauds and forgeries.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's 3 that are accepted, though you and I are a little suspicious about the dialogue with Trypho for reasons already stated. Yeah, like, that's going to be hard to deal with, Logos, when like almost everything attributed to you is made up.
Yeah.
That's gonna put a damper on because we know that now, right? In the Middle Ages, people believed it because they were gullible, but now we know. We've proved it through textual criticism, and now nobody makes appeal to those anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that's over. Apparently, Irenaeus did not get used in that way.
Lucky him. I guess the people who would have interpolated the text or whatever didn't understand the story either.
Yeah, embedding it in the Gnostic narrative was a defense mechanism against future tampering.
Yeah, they didn't get it either. They're like, this story is so crazy, we don't even want to touch it because it's like a minefield.
Right. Yeah, like I said before, I think Irenaeus deserves the title of the philosopher more than Justin does.
It would have been nice to see more stuff that was uniquely Justin's. Maybe Justin could have held his own. But yeah, so far, every argument that Irenaeus makes, even if I disagree with it, it's got the bones of arguments we're still talking about to this day that have kind of, quote, held up. And so you got to give the guy props.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely dug into the meat of it, right? And he's not okay, well, again, we can, to my knowledge, he's not actively misquoting the Gnostics, but the actual philosophical arguments he's making, like with the dialogue with Trypho, he just totally mischaracterizes the different schools.
Yeah.
Like, Irenaeus at least is not doing that.
As far as I can see, yeah.
Yeah, he's giving his own, because even when he talks about in chapter 14, the ideas they get from the Greeks, from the poets and the philosophers, as near as I can tell, that seems to hold up.
Well, that's
that
good.
those were doctrines that those philosophers held. I mean, so yeah, I think he's holding up a bit better. So yeah, is that all you got, Logos? Because I'm. It was hard, but I tried to figure out what the forest was.
Hey, you did good, man. You did way better than like I told you before the stream. I tried to read it, and all I got out of it was a headache because there's so many names I just couldn't. Like, who the heck was this person again? I don't even know. So, yeah, you did a good job. Hopefully next week will be easier so I can contribute more.
That's okay, Logos. All right, everyone. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.